Somewhere in the Caribbean Sea, around the year 1680, a ship cuts through black water under a moonless sky. On board, 40 men who would be hanged if caught. Murderers, deserters, runaway slaves, failed merchants, and one or two genuine lunatics. They have no government, no navy backing them, no law except the one they wrote themselves. And they did write one. Before a single cannon was fired, before they chased a single merchant vessel, these men sat down and drafted a contract. Not a loose agreement, not a handshake deal. A written constitution that every man aboard had to sign before the ship left port. It covered wages, injury compensation, rules of combat, voting rights, and the distribution of stolen goods down to the last silver coin. Now imagine an old nautical chart spreading open across a wooden table. Trace your finger from Port Royal, Jamaica, across the Caribbean basin, past Tortuga and the Windward Passage, down to the Spanish Main, around the Horn of South America, across the Atlantic to the west coast of Africa, and then up to the pirate haven of Nassau in the Bahamas. Every one of those routes was sailed by men who operated under some version of this code. From the Caribbean to Madagascar, from the Atlantic slave trade routes to the Indian Ocean, this wasn't some local tradition. It was a system that spread across the entire Golden Age of Piracy. When Disney built Pirates of the Caribbean, they turned this history into a punchline. The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules. Captain Barbossa says that line, and the audience laughs because it sounds like pirates being pirates. Lawless, chaotic, making it up as they go. But here's what the movie got completely backwards. The real pirate code wasn't flexible at all. It was rigid. It was enforced. And in many cases, it was more democratic than anything happening in the governments these pirates had abandoned. This is the true story of the Code of the Brethren, not the Hollywood version, the real one. And it's stranger, darker, and more radical than any movie could make it. To understand why pirates needed a code at all, you have to understand what life was like on a legal ship in the late 1600s and early 1700s. If you served in the Royal Navy or on a merchant vessel, your captain was essentially a dictator. He decided your rations. He decided your punishment. He decided whether you lived or died. And the punishments were medieval. Flogging was standard. Keel hauling, where a sailor was dragged under the barnacle-encrusted hull of the ship, could strip the skin off a man's body. Some didn't survive it. Pay was a joke. Merchant sailors were often cheated out of wages entirely. Captains would dock pay for imaginary offenses, extend voyages without compensation, or simply refuse to pay when the ship returned to port. There was no court a common sailor could appeal to. The captain's word was law, and the law backed the captain. Food was another weapon of control. Rations were distributed at the captain's discretion, and a captain who wanted to punish a man without leaving marks could simply cut his food. Hardtack crawling with weevils, salt pork so old it had turned green, water stored in barrels so foul that sailors held their noses to drink it. That was the standard. And if the captain decided you didn't even deserve that, you starved until he changed his mind. Officers ate better, of course. Fresh bread, actual meat, wine. The hierarchy of food mirrored the hierarchy of power, and both were absolute. Sickness killed more sailors than combat ever did. Scurvy, dysentery, typhus, and a dozen other diseases tore through crews on long voyages. A ship that left England with 200 men might arrive in the Caribbean with 120. The dead were thrown overboard. The sick were left to rot in hammocks below deck. Medical care was primitive when it existed at all, and on many ships it simply didn't exist. There was no surgeon. There was no medicine chest. There was a captain who told you to stop complaining and get back to work. Royal Navy sailors had it even worse in some ways. Impressment gangs roamed the port towns of England, literally kidnapping men off the streets and forcing them into naval service. You could be walking to a pub in Bristol, and wake up on a warship bound for the West Indies with no say in the matter. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second. because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Once aboard, you served until the Navy decided you were done, which could be years. So, when men turned pirate, they weren't just chasing treasure. Many of them were running from something. Running from captains who beat them. Running from navies that enslaved them. Running from a system where a common working man had no rights, no voice, and no recourse. And the first thing these men did when they formed a pirate crew wasn't to elect a captain or plan a raid. It was to sit down and write a set of rules that guaranteed the one thing they'd never had on a legal ship, a say in how things were run. The earliest documented pirate codes date back to the buccaneers of the 1600s, the rough bands of hunters and raiders who operated out of Hispaniola and Tortuga before the Golden Age of Piracy even began. These buccaneers were originally cattle hunters and pig roasters, mostly French and English outcasts who'd been pushed to the margins of colonial society. When they turned to raiding Spanish ships, they brought a surprisingly organized approach with them. The French buccaneers called their agreement the chasse party, which roughly translates to charter party, a term borrowed from legitimate shipping contracts. Before any expedition, the crew would gather and negotiate the terms. How would plunder be divided? What would a man receive if he lost a limb? Who would lead? And under what authority? These weren't vague conversations. The chasse party was written down, and every man who intended to sail had to agree to its terms. Refusal meant you stayed on shore. There was no, "I'll figure it out later." You were either in or you were out, and if you were in, you were bound. The most remarkable feature of these early codes was the compensation schedule for injuries. Lose your right arm. You received 600 pieces of 8 or 6 slaves. Lose your left arm, 500 pieces of 8 or 5 slaves. Lose a right leg, 500. Lose a left leg, 400. Lose an eye, 100. Lose a finger, 100. These payments came off the top of any plunder, before any other division was made. Think about what that means for a moment. In the 1680s, while European monarchies were still debating whether common people had any rights at all, a group of Caribbean outlaws had created what was essentially a workers' compensation system. A pirate who was maimed in battle was guaranteed financial support. No legal ship in the world offered anything close to that. The chasse party also established how disputes would be resolved, how food and water would be rationed during lean times, and what happened to a man's share if he died during the expedition. In many cases, a dead pirate's share was sent to his next of kin, a widow, a mother, sometimes a woman in a port town the crew knew by name. These were written into the charter before the ship sailed. The buccaneers treated death as a logistical certainty and planned for it accordingly. What the buccaneers established in the 1660s and 1670s became the foundation for everything that followed. When the Golden Age of Piracy exploded in the early 1700s, the captains who led it didn't invent the concept of pirate articles from scratch. They inherited it from the buccaneers, refined it, and turned it into something even more sophisticated. The most famous pirate code in history belongs to Bartholomew Roberts, known to his contemporaries as Black Bart. Roberts was arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, capturing over 400 ships during his career. He was also, by all accounts, a disciplinarian who ran his ship like a well-oiled machine. And the machine ran on his articles. Roberts' code contained 11 articles, and every one of them tells you something about what life on a pirate ship actually looked like. Article 1 stated that every man had a vote in affairs of the moment. Every man had equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquors at any time seized, and could use them at pleasure unless a scarcity made it necessary for the common good to vote a retrenchment. That first line is the one that matters most. Every man had a vote. Not the captain, not the officers, every man. In an era when the vast majority of people in England, France, and Spain had no say whatsoever in how they were governed, pirate ships were operating as direct democracies. The crew voted on where to sail, whether to attack a target, and how to distribute the spoils. The captain could be voted out at any time for any reason. He served at the pleasure of the crew, not the other way around. Article 2 covered the distribution of plunder. The captain and the quartermaster received 2 shares each. The master gunner and boatswain received 1.5 shares. All other officers received 1.25 shares. Common crew received 1 share each. Compare that to a legal merchant vessel, where the captain and owners might take 60 to 80% of all profits, while the crew split the scraps. On a pirate ship, the gap between the highest paid officer and the lowest common sailor was never more than 2 to 1. Roberts' Code essentially created one of the most equitable pay structures in the Atlantic world. Article 3 banned gambling for money on board. Cards and dice were forbidden. This wasn't about morality. It was practical. Gambling debts caused fights. Fights caused divisions. And divisions on a ship in the middle of the ocean got people killed. Article 4 required all candles and lights to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any man wanted to drink after that hour, he had to do it on the open deck. Again, purely practical. Open flames below deck on a wooden ship loaded with gunpowder were not a matter of personal preference. They were a matter of survival. Article 5 required every man to keep his weapons clean and ready for action at all times. A pirate who neglected his pistols or cutlass was a liability to the entire crew. This wasn't optional. Your weapons were inspected, and failure to maintain them could result in punishment. Article 6 addressed desertion. No man could talk of breaking up their way of living until each had shared 1,000 pounds. If any man did abandon his post or tried to desert, the punishment was marooning. Not execution, marooning. You were left on a deserted island with a pistol, a single shot, a bottle of water, and nothing else. Whether you used the pistol on yourself or waited for starvation was your business. Article 7 dealt with fighting on board. No man could strike another while on board the ship. If 2 pirates had a dispute, they were required to wait until they reached shore, at which point they could fight a duel under the supervision of the quartermaster. This prevented the kind of brawling that could spiral into mutiny or cripple the crew before a fight. Article 8 banned bringing women or boys aboard the ship disguised. If any man were found seducing any woman and carried her to sea in disguise, the punishment was death. This sounds extreme, and it was, but the reasoning was again practical rather than moral. The introduction of romantic interests into a confined, high-stress environment was viewed as a guaranteed source of jealousy, violence, and division. Article 9 was the Injury Compensation Clause. A man who lost a limb or became crippled in service was to receive $800 from the common stock, with lesser injuries paid proportionally. This was Roberts's version of the chasse-partie compensation tables, updated for his era. Article 10 covered the crew's hierarchy during combat. The musicians were to rest on the Sabbath day, but the other 6 days and nights, they were available at any time without special allowance. Even the band had a contract. Article 11 established a penalty for cowardice. Any man who did not fight courageously would be punished as the captain and majority of the crew saw fit. This was deliberately vague, giving the crew flexibility, but the message was clear. Cowards endangered everyone, and everyone would decide their fate. Roberts enforced these articles without exception. He was known to maroon men for violations, and his crew respected the code precisely because they knew it would be applied equally to every man on board, including Roberts himself. The captain was not above the law. He was subject to it. But Roberts wasn't the only captain with a code. Nearly every major pirate captain of the Golden Age operated under some version of written articles, and the variations tell you a lot about the different personalities and priorities of each crew. Captain John Phillips, who terrorized the Atlantic in the early 1720s, had a code that was notably harsher than Roberts'. Phillips's articles included a provision that any man who deserted during battle would be punished by death or marooning. Another article stated that if any man robbed another in the company to the value of even a single dollar, he would have his nose and ears slit and be set ashore, where he was sure to encounter hardships. Edward Lowe, one of the most notoriously violent pirates in history, had articles that reflected his brutality. Lowe's code specified that any man who did not keep his arms clean and fit for engagement would be cut off from his share and suffer whatever punishment the captain and company thought fit. Given that Lowe was known for torturing captives in ways that made even other pirates uncomfortable, whatever punishment the captain thought fit carried a very specific kind of weight. Captain George Lowther's articles included a fascinating clause about medical care. When a surgeon was carried by any ship, Lowther's code specified that his chest of medicines was to be available for the entire crew, and the surgeon himself was to receive a salary of $250 above his share. Even pirates recognized the value of health care, and they were willing to pay a premium for it. Henry Morgan, the famous buccaneer who raided Panama City in 1671, operated under articles that were almost corporate in their precision. Morgan's code specified exactly how much each rank would receive from any plunder. The admiral, meaning Morgan himself, received 1/100th of the total haul. Each captain received 8 shares. Soldiers received 1 share. The surgeon received 200 pieces of 8 + 1 share. And the compensation for injuries was itemized down to the last digit, with different amounts for left and right limbs, different amounts for eyes versus fingers, and specific provisions for internal injuries that prevented a man from working. And then there was Blackbeard. Edward Teach, or Thatch, depending on which historian you ask. Blackbeard's articles have never been found, which is itself telling. He was known to burn his own papers before capture, and his crew was scattered or killed at his final battle off Ocracoke Island in 1718. But we know from crew testimony and captured sailors that Blackbeard operated under a code, and we know from the same sources that he enforced it brutally. One crew member testified that Blackbeard shot his own first mate under the table during a card game, then told the crew he had to kill one of them now and then or they'd forget who he was. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Whether that story is true or embellished, it tells you what Blackbeard wanted his reputation to be. A captain who enforced discipline through fear as much as through written articles. What's remarkable about all of these codes is not their differences, but their similarities. Across different ships, different captains, different years, and different oceans, the same fundamental principles kept appearing. Democratic governance, equitable pay, compensation for injury, rules against internal violence, provisions for dispute resolution. These weren't coincidences. They were evidence of a shared pirate culture, a way of organizing society that pirates carried with them from ship to ship and port to port. The role of the quartermaster was arguably the most radical political innovation in the entire pirate system, and it's one that no movie has ever gotten right. On a legal ship, the captain held absolute power. On a pirate ship, power was deliberately split. The captain commanded during battle. He made tactical decisions in the heat of combat, and his orders were followed without question, because hesitation during a fight got people killed. But outside of battle, the quartermaster was the real authority. The quartermaster settled disputes. The quartermaster distributed food, water, and plunder. The quartermaster decided punishments for violations of the code. The quartermaster represented the interests of the crew against the captain. This was a system of checks and balances. The captain couldn't become a tyrant because the quartermaster had the authority and the crew's backing to restrain him. The quartermaster couldn't seize total power because the captain commanded in battle. Neither could dominate the other, and both served at the pleasure of the crew. Now think about when this was happening. The late 1600s and early 1700s. The Glorious Revolution in England had only recently established the principle that a king couldn't rule without Parliament. France was still decades away from its revolution. The United States wouldn't exist for another 50 to 80 years. And here, on floating wooden vessels crewed by society's rejects, a working system of separated powers was already in daily operation. Some historians have argued that pirate governance actually influenced democratic thought in the broader Atlantic world. Marcus Rediker, one of the leading scholars of pirate history, has documented how pirate ideas about equality and self-governance circulated through port towns and pamphlets during the same decades that Enlightenment philosophers were theorizing about similar concepts. That's a debatable claim in terms of direct influence, but what isn't debatable is the timeline. Pirates were practicing democratic self-governance before most of the Western world had even theorized about it. When Disney adapted the Pirate Code for Pirates of the Caribbean, they got a few things right and a whole lot wrong. They got the existence of the code right. There really was a codified set of rules. They got the idea of the Brethren Court partially right. There were gatherings of pirate captains, though they looked nothing like the Grand Council shown in At World's End. The real meetings were messy, drunken affairs held in taverns in ports like Nassau and Tortuga, where captains negotiated alliances, divided territory, and tried to avoid shooting each other long enough to agree on mutual targets. The real Brethren Court, if you can call it that, was centered around Nassau in the Bahamas during the peak years of 1715 to 1718. Nassau had become a pirate republic, a town governed by pirates where captains like Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, and the Old Blackbeard all operated. The code in Nassau wasn't a single document. It was a shared understanding, backed by the individual articles of each ship, that pirates would not prey on each other, would share intelligence about naval patrols and rich targets, and would provide safe harbor to any crew flying the black flag. This arrangement collapsed when Woodes Rogers arrived as the new royal governor in 1718, with a pardon in one hand and a noose in the other. Many pirates accepted the pardon. Those who didn't were hunted down. The Pirate Republic of Nassau lasted barely 3 years, but during that time, it functioned as something genuinely unprecedented, a community of outlaws governing themselves by mutual agreement. But the fundamental joke of the franchise, that the code was more like guidelines, gets the history exactly backwards. The real pirate code was binding. It was enforced. Violations were punished severely. Men were marooned, flogged, or killed for breaking the articles. The code existed specifically because pirates understood that without enforceable rules, their entire enterprise would collapse into chaos. These were men who had experienced the chaos of lawless authority on legal ships where captains could do whatever they wanted with no accountability. They had lived under a system with no rules for the common man, and they knew exactly how that ended. So they created rules, and they took those rules seriously. The movie's treatment of the code as a joke serves the comedy, but it erases the thing that makes real pirate codes genuinely fascinating. These weren't guidelines adopted by people who didn't care about order. They were constitutions adopted by people who cared deeply about order because they'd seen what happened without it. The code also reveals something about pirate society that tends to catch historians off guard when they first encounter it. Pirates were, in many ways, radically inclusive for their era. Black pirates served on many crews and were, at least in theory, entitled to equal shares under the Articles. This was not the norm in the 1700s. The Atlantic world was built on racial slavery, and the idea of a black man receiving equal pay and equal voice alongside white sailors was genuinely revolutionary. Whether this equality was always practiced as written is another question, and the historical record is mixed. But the fact that it was written into the articles at all tells you something about the values these men were trying to build. Escaped slaves made up a significant portion of many pirate crews, particularly those operating in the Caribbean. For these men, the pirate code represented something more than just an employment contract. It represented a kind of freedom that simply didn't exist anywhere else in the Atlantic world. Under the articles, a formerly enslaved man had a vote, a share of the plunder, and the right to dispute the captain's decisions. No plantation, no colony, and no legal ship offered anything comparable. The code also addressed something unthinkable in polite society: disability rights. The compensation schedules weren't just about money. They established the principle that a man who was injured in service to the crew maintained his right to support even after he could no longer fight. He wasn't discarded. He wasn't abandoned. He was paid out and, in some cases, given a role on the ship he could still perform. Compare that to the navies and merchant fleets, where injured sailors were dumped on shore with nothing. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted roughly from the 1690s to the 1730s, and the code evolved throughout that period. The earliest phase, dominated by buccaneers in the Caribbean, produced relatively simple codes focused on plunder and survival. The middle phase, roughly 1710 to 1722, was the peak. This was when Nassau thrived, when Blackbeard terrorized the American coastline, when Roberts captured 400 ships, and when the articles reached their most sophisticated form. The final phase, from about 1722 to 1730, was the crackdown. Royal navies began systematic patrols. Governors offered pardons, and then hangings. Pirate trials became public spectacles designed to discourage future recruits. By 1730, the Golden Age was effectively over, and the codes went with it. Early buccaneering codes were relatively simple, focused mainly on plunder division and injury compensation. By the time Roberts and his contemporaries were sailing in the 1720s, the articles had grown into comprehensive documents that addressed nearly every aspect of shipboard life. But the codes also had their limits, and those limits are worth being honest about. The violence was real. Pirate justice could be swift and cruel. Marooning was effectively a death sentence delivered slowly. Men who violated the articles didn't get a second hearing or an appeal. The crew voted, and the sentence was carried out. The democracy of the pirate ship was real, but it was a hard democracy, one that combined genuine self-governance with the constant threat of extreme punishment. And not every pirate operated under a code. Some captains, particularly the more sociopathic ones like Edward Lowe, used their articles as tools of control rather than instruments of fairness. Lowe's code technically gave the crew a voice, but Lowe himself was so feared and so violent that few men dared challenge him. The code existed on paper, but in practice, Lowe's ship was as much a dictatorship as any Royal Navy vessel. There's also the uncomfortable truth that pirates, whatever their internal codes of conduct, made their living through violence, theft, and frequently murder. The code governed how pirates treated each other. It said nothing about how they treated their victims. Merchant crews were robbed, beaten, and sometimes killed. Captives were tortured for information about hidden cargo. Entire towns were sacked and burned. The code made pirate society functional, but it didn't make it moral. What makes the pirate code endure in our imagination, beyond the movies and the theme park rides, is the question it forces us to ask. What happens when the people at the bottom of the social order create their own system of rules? These were men who had been beaten, cheated, kidnapped, and exploited by the legal systems of their time. They had every reason to abandon the very concept of law and order. They could have operated as pure anarchists, every man for himself, strongest takes all. But they didn't. They sat down and wrote constitutions. They created democratic governance. They established compensation for the injured. They limited the power of their leaders. They insisted on rules because they understood, from bitter personal experience, that the absence of rules didn't mean freedom. It meant that the strongest and cruelest would dominate everyone else. The pirate code wasn't perfect. It wasn't always applied fairly, and the men who lived under it weren't heroes. But the code itself represents something genuinely important in the history of human governance. It's evidence that the desire for fairness, representation, and the rule of law isn't limited to philosophers and politicians. It lives in ordinary people, even the ones society has labeled as criminals. 300 years later, we still tell stories about these men. We dress up as them for Halloween. We build theme park rides around them. We make billion-dollar movie franchises about them. And every single version of the story, from Treasure Island to Pirates of the Caribbean, circles back to the same thing, the code. Not because it's a fun plot device, but because somewhere deep in the human imagination, the idea of people creating their own rules, governing themselves, and holding each other accountable still resonates. Even when those people were thieves, even when the rules were written in taverns on the backs of stolen maps, even when the punishment for breaking them was death on a deserted island. The irony is that the real pirate code was everything Barbossa said it wasn't. It wasn't flexible. It wasn't optional. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the one thing that separated a pirate crew from a floating mob. And every pirate who ever sailed under the black flag knew it. Take away the code, and you don't have pirates. You have chaos. You have 40 armed men on a wooden ship with no agreement about who gets what, who leads, or what happens when someone steps out of line. That ship doesn't last a week. It tears itself apart from the inside. The code was never just guidelines. It was the whole point.